So, hello, John.
Hi, Carlotta. Nice to meet you.
It's my pleasure to meet you. John, you're a freelance writer and you write for The Guardian and The Times, basically the most important newspapers in the world. And you are also the author of this amazing book for Blackie Edizioni, and it's the David Bowie's book club. So it's not a biography. So it's not a proper biography. With this book, you explore a list of the 100 books David Bowie liked the most in his life. So can you tell us, how did you approach to this? How did you approach the list, and why did you decide to talk and write about this important, huge list?
Yeah, of course. As you probably know, the list was one that Bowie himself came up with, and it was released to the world in, I think, 2013 to tie in with the Victorian Albert Museum's exhibition. David Bowie is this exhibition, this retrospective look at his life, which collected together all his costumes and everything, lyric sheets, everything that he'd collected to do with his career over the course of his life. And it opened in Toronto after London. It was its first port of call after London. And so I think to drum up publicity for it, he released this list, and it's a really interesting list. And when it came out, there was a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about it, because it seemed to offer clues to the way that David Bowie thought. And I think if you were an obsessive David Bowie fan, like me, you're always looking for clues. Why did he make those decisions? Where does that costume come from? Where does that video idea come from? And where do those lyrics come from? And here was this list that seemed in some oblique way to tell you. So it was a very tantalizing thing for a fan to want to just seek out, explore those clues a bit more, and see what kind of answers I could come up with.
Yeah, and I think that it's pretty important for a David Bowie fan to join and read this list. Also because David Bowie was #1 fan of clues. He
Yeah.
loved to hide information and clues, and
Yes.
in all of his work, we can think about Black Star, the last album. In the cover,
Yes.
there are tons of
Yeah.
things hidden and stuff like that. So basically, viewing this list, you can discover a lot of his poetry and art.
That's right.
And
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, adding to what I said earlier, he was of all the pop stars I can think of, he was the one who had a very keen, strong sense of his connection to his audience, and he knew exactly what his audience wanted, and he was always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. What can I give them? What will excite them? And so it was a very self-conscious thing. It wasn't. It was offered up as a kind of game. He knew exactly how it would be received, and so he was sort of playing a game with his audience. He was someone who was always very aware of his own mythology. He knew that he had sort of supers for whom he was a very, very important figure, and I think he respected that, and he wanted to give something back. And for me, the list is really him giving something back to the fans and saying, off you go, see what you can find. And I love that idea. It's very playful.
yeah, it's like a seek and find game.
Yes.
Basically, you can see the steps of his stylist evolution. So I want to talk with you about this. Can you see his evolution through his books? Can you see his different characters, his figures with this list? So basically, I saw that there's Ziggy Stardust exploded as soon as he read Clockwork Orange
Yes.
by Bargis. So basically, can you explain us his steps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things about the list is that it goes right back to his childhood. So it actually predates his sort of eruption onto the scene as a pop star. we go right back to the books that he would have read in his suburban bedroom in the late 1950s. So there are books by English writers like Keith Waterhouse, who wrote a book called Billy Liar that was made into a very influential film starring Julie Christie, and he loved that. And the Beano, which is a British comic, he was a big fan of comics and graphic novels. So he's really going right back to the formation of his cultural consciousness. And then as we move a little bit further on, as you say, we find the books that started to influence his way of thinking about art and creativity. And a very important book here is On the Road by Jack
On the
Kerouac.
Road, Jack Kerouac, yeah.
Which I think is probably the most important book on the list in many ways, because it has a very personal connection to him, because it was recommended to him by his half brother Terry, who suffered from schizophrenia and had a very sort of tortured, difficult life. He was incarcerated in an asylum in South London, not far from where Bowie lived, and far from where he grew up, just south of Croydon. And Terry was a very sort of romanticized, idealized figure for Bowie. He was someone who always seemed to know where the exciting things were going on culturally. So he introduced him to jazz and blue beat and so beat literature, Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and all these things that later became very important for Bowie in the way he thought about how to create art. All of that came from Terry. So in a way, you can almost say he was always had Terry in his mind. What would Terry think? What would Terry do? And of course, Terry turns up throughout Bowie's career in songs like All the Madmen, and he's very important. So the other thing about On the Road is, of course, this idea of spontaneous creation. On the Road was written in a 2-week sort of benzodrine fuel burst, on a continuous scroll of paper, famously.
Yeah, I remember that it was written on toilet paper. Yeah.
And Bowie actually did really create like that. I mean, what people who work with Bowie say is that he was very, very fast. He really liked to create things in the moment. He would write lyrics very, very quickly. He got bored very quickly, especially in recording studios. He liked to do 2 takes at the most when he was recording a vocal. And I think that wanting to be in the moment, that feeling that the moment is very important and you have to embrace it and get the most out of it, all of that comes from, it's a beat aesthetic, and the beat aesthetic comes from On the Road, and On the Road comes from Terry. So a very important book on the list.
And there's also a parallelism in between the Beat generation and the mods in London in the time.
Absolutely. So Terry was very much a bit, beatnik. But for Bowie was a bit young to be a proper beat. So by the time Bowie was in his late teens, beat had sort of become mod. It had this sort of Italian influence, the smartphones and the Vespers and all of that. And he was a beautiful mod. If you've seen pictures of him when in his mod phase, he looks great. And I think one of the things that he did was make this connection between mod as a sort of style of the novelty and looking forward to the future, and the kind of books that Terry was talking about, and of course mod is short for modernism and modernist literature, like T.S. Eliot and The Great Gatsby and all that kind of thing. It's interesting that all of that ties up. And I think he made that connection between, smart dressing and, creating this sort of very stylized, sharp, smart, modern persona, and that kind of literature. There's a lot of modernist literature on the list. The kind of books that intellectual mods would have read and because mod was also an intellectual movement. I mean, I think when we think of mod now, we think of perhaps there's a film Quadrophenia, the Who's film, people on wearing parkas and looking a bit sort of scruffy, because mod kind of went through various different mutations. And I think for Bowie, he was always thinking about that first iteration of mod as a very smart intellectual movement, And I think also for people like Pete Townsend of the Who, that's what it was as well. It was a thinking person's movement. It wasn't just about sort of drugs
Passion.
and
It
parties
wasn't.
and
Yeah.
floating on the beaches and that kind of thing.
And On the Road is actually really important book also for Bowie's spirituality, isn't it? It travels.
Yeah,
It's
that's right.
kind of
Yeah.
connected with Buddhism. Do you
Yeah,
say that?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's the whole, the Buddhist thing that runs through, Kerouac's work, and Bowie always considered himself to be a Buddhist. I mean, I think he experimented with lots of different religions over the course of his life, and I think if you'd asked him at various points what he was, you would have got a different answer. But most of the time, he said he was a Buddhist, and actually he was cremated, from what I understand, in a Buddhist ceremony, and I think in Bali. So it was obviously, very, very important to him. And there are lots of books that touch on Buddhism on the list. There's a really interesting book, I think it's by Douglas Harding, about On Having No Head, about having this sort of transcendental epiphany of realizing that you have no ego. This I'm trying to explain. The importance, I think, of what we now think of as mindfulness and ego death and that kind of thing. And Bowie was always really interested in that sort of thing.
Yes, it definitely it was. I think that basically, I read in the introduction you made that Bowie was a passionate reader. He traveled the US with a huge luggage with books
Yeah,
in it.
yeah, that's
Can you
right.
explain this amazing story? Because I can't figure out
Yeah.
how was it.
It's funny, it's a very pre-Kindle age. It's funny to think of now that we can all carry thousands of books around with us everywhere we go, but obviously you couldn't do that back then. So it was when he was filming The Man Who Fell to Earth, and a lot of the shoot took place in New Mexico, and he took with him to the set of just this massive portable library of thousands of books. He had these specially made like packing cases, a bit like the cases that you store amplifiers and things in if you're going on tour as a band. And he had them sort of specially reconfigured with shelves, and they would stored loads of books. And from what people say, a lot of the books were about the occult, which was, because at that point he was in the depths of his kind of coke mad
Yeah.
Los Angeles sort of phase, where he was just, really into kind of Satanism and general madness. So yeah, I think he was sitting there reading his Aleister Crowley books, and yeah, and during breaks in the filming, he would just go off to his trailer, and with a few titles from his mad library of occult books, and just sit there and have a very nice time reading about, you know, uh, Aleister Crowley or whatever. But yeah, and so there are a few books on the list I think that probably date from that period. Although weirdly, not the most famous books that people say he read during that time. I mean, it's quite a well chronicled period in his life, and I was quite surprised by how few of the books he'd put on that list. I think maybe it wasn't a kind of period in his life that he really wanted to look back on. He was probably a
Yeah.
bit embarrassed by some of some of those books. So there are things we might have expected to see that aren't there.
Yeah, probably yes. It's like that because, as you said, he read a lot of those books during this rehab from really a hard drug period,
Yeah, yeah,
and he got into books so hard that can we say that was a kind of addiction as well? He got addicted to
yeah.
books.
I think it was. I think he was. He was a very compulsive kind of person, and which you often find in people, I think, with addiction issues. Not to generalize, but in my experience, a lot of the people who I know who have had problems with alcohol or drugs, they have that kind of like sort of manic fervor and enthusiasm for things. And yeah, I think he was someone who was very when he decided to get hold of something, a subject or a project or something like that, he was very kind of like really on it. And I think reading was like that for him. I mean, I think he enjoyed collecting books. He enjoyed, recommending books to his friends and family. And it's interesting. An artist friend of mine, who showed me actually when I was doing a promotional talk for the book in the UK, he came up to me afterwards, and he'd written to Bowie in Berlin. I'm not really expecting to get any kind of reply. He wrote to him where he knew he was staying in 1978, and he got a reply from Bowie recommending, all the books that he was reading at the time. And he showed me this letter, and it had the publishers and where he could find the books from and all this kind of thing. So, the stories are true. He was like that. He was always recommending books to people. And in fact, one of the books he recommended to this artist friend was one of the books that's on the list, which is The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, which is one of the maddest books on the list. And it's interesting that was so important to him.
And basically, we can say that Bowie always had a really big passion for reviews, because he started writing reviews as well. So he didn't just suggest books to people, but he started writing down reviews for Barnes and Noble.
He did. Yeah, he did. I mean, I think on his website, he was quite an early adopter of the internet, and on his Bowie.net, his early website, he would often write blogs, and before we really thought of them as blogs, and he'd recommend books and stuff. And he also signed some kind of deal to write books for Barnes and Noble, the American bookstore chain. And because a friend of mine interviewed him for Time Out magazine around that time, and he was very excited about having been asked to do this. And he did.
Yeah, so it was a bookaholic, as we can say, something like that.
Yeah.
So I think that I saw something like 3 big books I want to talk about. One was On the Road, we already talked about. One is The Metamorphosis from Kafka. Basically, if you think about Bowie, you think about Kafka Metamorphosis, because David Bowie was so eclectic. He changed tons of styles, and so if you think about it's Kafka's main book, and I read that he had vivid dreams about this book. Can you tell us?
Yeah, he said that he dreamt that he was turning into a beetle, and that he said that the book affected him very profoundly, and although interestingly, that's not one of the books that ended up on the list, but it probably should be there. I mean, there are several books that fall into that category. But yeah, that's right. I mean, he was always changing, and I think the idea of metamorphosis was really important to him. And I think again, the reason the list is so important is because his method as an artist was this sort of magpie method. He was always looking for what he could steal. And I mean steal in a really positive way. I don't mean that he was stealing other people's ideas. But I think whenever he saw a painting or a book or heard a song, first of all, he was thinking about whether he enjoyed it, but then he was thinking, how can I use it? So he's always moving through life thinking, and hoovering up these little bits that he can take and reconfigure and shape into something else. And and he was quite honest about that. I think T.S. Eliot, who is on the list, wrote a famous essay, and I'm going to misquote it now, but he said something like, bad poets imitate, good poets steal. And I think Bowie took that to heart and thought, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to be the good poet who steals rather than the bad poet who imitates. And that's that's where that's a very important kind of philosophy for him.
And there's a main character who worked with him on his image and his metamorphosis, and he was Lindsay Kemp, probably one of the most brilliant transformer ever. And I met him when I was younger, and he had a show here in Florence, and I started crying because it was so powerful show,
Yeah,
and you can see how much Bowie took from him. And there's
yeah,
the Great Gatsby book that it's
yeah,
mainly important for this elegance.
yeah.
Can you explain us the Lindsay Camp relationship with Bowie and the Great Gatsby importance in his
Yeah,
life?
I'll try to. I mean, I think one of the things he got from, well, for a start to say, first of all, I think Bowie was always in his younger days looking for mentor figures. He was looking for people who could guide him and show him things because he was quite uneducated. He left school with I think only one qualification, which was in art, quite a basic qualification in art. So he wasn't very good at being taught, but he liked teaching himself. And he I think was always quite aware that he didn't know as much as he should, and so when he would latch on to figures who he thought could teach him. And one of them was an early manager called Kenneth Pitt, who was quite cultured and had a flat in central London, and he was very plugged into the cultural scene, and he had lots of books. And Bowie used to like being in his flat and browsing his bookshelves and reading Oscar Wilde and whoever else. And Christopher Isherwood. It was Kenneth Pitt who introduced him to Christopher Isherwood. He's another very important writer for him. And around that time, he was studying movement and mime with Lindsay Kemp, and I think what Lindsay Kemp showed him was the importance of sort of posture and how you carry yourself, almost that kind of balletic element, which is, I think, is very important when you look at Bowie and you think of him as a performer. He's very, very conscious about how he's moving. In fact, whenever you see him in public, he's moving very carefully, and he's upright, and he knows how to command a room, and he knows how to move his body to get the effect that he wants. And I think all of that comes from Lindsay Kemp. Lindsay Kemp, told him how to harness all that kind of energy in order to project the image that he wanted to project. And I think probably encouraged him to watch people like Frank Sinatra, who was a very important figure for him as well. He apparently used to watch Sinatra, the way Sinatra moved in films, the way he moved on stage, and that kind of effortless. It is quite amazing to watch, and he was continuing. Even when you watch him in something like the Glass Spider Tour, which wasn't one of his better concerts, I was watching that recently. I hurt my back recently, and I was watching the Glass Spider Tour. And of course, Bowie's in his early 40s, as we sort of around my age, a bit younger than me. And I was just amazed by how easily he was kind of moving, and how sort of graceful and energetic and lithe he was, even as a man in his late 40s, and he was smoking, 50 cigarettes a day. He's in great condition, really. The sexuality thing as well with Lindsay Kemp. I mean, I think, he became very aware at that time that he was very attractive to men as well as women. And I think he and Lindsay Kemp had a very, at the very least, very flirtatious relationship. I mean, some people would say that they were lovers. I don't know if that's true. Some people would also say that he and Kenneth Pitt were lovers, and that Bowie sort of slightly exploited his attractiveness to men to get what he wanted without actually being gay himself. I'm not sure that Bowie was ever actually gay or bisexual. I think he just did whatever he wanted or thought was kind of
Fluid.
Yes, as we would now say, yes. Yeah.
And I think that I read that there's another important character for Bowie, speaking about movements, and that's Alex from Clockwork Orange.
Yes, yeah.
Because the walk, the walk he had. And I read that there's an important stylish thing with Bowie and Clockwork Orange, movie plus book, both of them.
Yeah.
So he has a really close relationship with Kubrick and Burgess as well.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard to know what came first for him, the book or the film. But I suspect probably the book. I think he probably had read the book. And the film really, I mean, it's hard to get the timeline right. I mean, so around the time that Bowie first started thinking about Ziggy Stardust and about that look, and with the big boots and all that kind of stuff, I mean, really, that was really just after the film had come out, and when Ziggy appeared on stage, it was using the music from A Clockwork Orange, that Wendy Carlos synthesizer Beethoven music, and
Yeah.
so it was the whole package of A Clockwork Orange was incredibly important to the Ziggy Stardust look, and
Yeah.
and Alex and the Droogs, and I think he very much thought of the Spiders as being the Droogs with him as kind of Alex, looking beautiful at the front. So yeah, very important, very important thing. And of course he used the language that Anthony Burgess invented, this sort of mixture of Russian and the underground gay language Polari. But Bowie used that in songs like Suffragette City, but he also returned to it later, and he uses it on one of the songs on Black Star, a song called Girl Loves Me. Yeah, so very important for him.
So I want to ask you a thing. I know it's hard to choose, but which books are, in your opinion, the most important on this list to understand concretely David Bowie?
God, I think The Great Gatsby is really important. I don't mean you mentioned that earlier. I mean, not only, I mean, it is one of my favorite books, and I think it's so important to understand that how you create yourself, also that idea of charisma and how you can turn charisma on and off. And one of the things I think that's great about The Great Gatsby is that Gatsby doesn't appear in it for quite a long time, and then he does, and there's a great bit where I think I'm going to misquote it, but Fitzgerald describes Gatsby's smile, and that when Gatsby sort of smiles and shakes your hand, he makes you feel this incredibly warm feeling, as though he knows you and as though he's always understood you and is really interested in you. Charm really. But one of the things that Gatsby uses to create himself and make himself such an effective host is his incredible charm and politeness. And that was what Bowie was like. Bowie was exceptionally good at charming people and making people feel comfortable, and yet he could also turn that charisma down when he wanted. I mean, he used to tell the story about when he wanted to travel incognito on public transport, on trains or buses, he would disguise himself and sit and read a Greek newspaper, and then nobody would bother him. So he knew how not to be David Bowie. He knew how to pass through New York unobserved, but equally when he wanted to be noticed, he cranked it up, right to the full, and he could suddenly. I mean, I remember once interviewing Ryuichi Sakamoto, who's the Japanese musician and actor who Bowie acted with in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, he was. I remember him telling me that when Bowie was on the set filming, he was very. He got on with everybody. He was chatting and kind of, it was just like one of the lads. It was like an ordinary person. And then the next time he saw him, it was at Cannes Film Festival when the film was being presented for the first time. And he said it was like encountering a different person, because Bowie sort of stepped off the plane and he was in full David Bowie mode. And, he was holding himself in a different way. It was totally different. It was acting and projection, and very Gatsby-like, I think.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, Gatsby. It's I think one of the most interesting figures, and I can relate him to David Bowie. So before moving on past the end of this interview, I need you to tell us one thing.
Yeah.
The time you met David Bowie in 2002 in New York.
Oh yeah, well that was wonderful. It remains the high point of my professional life, really. It was quite a long time ago. It was in 2002, and at the time I was working for a magazine in London called Time Out, and there's a music festival that happens in London called Meltdown. It happens every year, and it's each year it's curated by a different person. Lots of sort of celebrated musicians have curated it over the years. And in 2002, it was David Bowie's turn, and Time Out used to sponsor the festival. So I went to New York to talk to him about his choices of artists for the festival, and yeah, it was wonderful. It was around the time that Heathen had come out, so we talked a lot about Heathen, and we met in a hotel just around the corner from his apartment. And yeah, my heart was kind of going because I sort of loved this man since I was 11, and I think I was about 30 when I met him. So it was, yeah, but he knew the effect he had on people, and as I said, he went to great trouble to put you at ease and make you feel comfortable, and he knew that you were probably a bit scared, and he was very, very funny. That's the thing that I wasn't prepared for. It was a bit like watching a stand-up comedian. He was constantly doing funny voices and telling jokes and kind of making fun of himself and making fun of the interview and making fun of the Rolling Stones. I remember there was a like a blimp, like a balloon floating in the sky in New York advertising the new Rolling Stones tour in 2002. And I remember he was constantly pointing at it and laughing and going, honestly, what are they doing? And just so, yeah, he was just very funny to be around, and yeah, I sort of really treasure it, really. And I can't just feel incredibly lucky to have met him. It's always nice to meet your heroes, and sometimes they disappoint you. Sometimes they can be not what you wanted them to be, and you can go away feeling a bit crushed. But with him, I've felt happy to have met him, and I wasn't disappointed in any way.
Fantastic. I probably faint or vomit from the anxiety to meet him. So good job.
You would have felt at ease because he would have loved, he would have loved you, and he would have, known exactly what to say to make you feel comfortable. I think he was used to people having that reaction, to people fainting and vomiting.
Okay. So I want you to ask one last question. Yeah. Basically, this list is kind of the last gift of David Bowie. It came out a couple of years before he died.
Yeah.
How is it important to understand David Bowie? How much is important? How much is important for a fan of David Bowie, this list? In your opinion, why is it so important to read all his books, all his favorite books, one by one?
I think it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. Like it's the clue to the man. I think when you're a fan of an artist or musician or actor, novelist, I think you always want to know the most you possibly can about them, because you're, as we said earlier, you're always looking for clues. And I think it's just such a good representation of the way he thought, and the way he felt, and the way he I think with him there was always a kind of split between David Jones, his kind of birth identity, the man he was when he was born, and David Bowie. David Bowie is like a kind of invention. It's like the person he became when he was dressing up and presenting himself and presenting his work to the world. And I think it's important to make the distinction between the two. I think the list is a really interesting insight into David Bowie. When he was putting on his clothes and putting on that persona, or that series of personas, where did they come from? It's great to have an additional, sort of box to rummage in. We've got the records, we've got the films, we've got the songs, and it's very, very few artists that I can think of are so interesting that you would want to read a list of their 100 books. I mean, I can only think of maybe Nick Cave or Kate Bush or someone like that. I mean, they're the only kind of equivalent people who I think you might want to be, you'd be very interested in what they were reading. And so yeah.
I thank you so much for this. Sorry for the lost in translation things, because
I wish I could speak Italian. That would be much easier. One day I will.
Thank you so much.
Of course,
And
lovely to meet you.
I'm finishing this today.
Okay, well,
Thank you
lovely to
so
meet
much.
you. Thank you very much. Yeah, take care.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.